Hello everyone and welcome to Build Ahead with Xynteo presents Decarbonising India's Construction, partnered by ET Now. I'm Avan Dabash. Well, we've seen India's demand for infrastructure and housing, which is expected to grow. The government's plan of growing India's economy to a $5 trillion economy by 2025 includes the aim of making 100 smart cities, expanding the capacity of Indian railways, housing for all, and among that, the Prime Minister has also made a pledge to make India net zero by 2070 and produce 50% of its energy from renewable resources by 2030. To achieve this, there needs to be a collaborative action across multiple sectors. Build Ahead, a business-led coalition formed by Xynteo, has been designed to tackle this challenge by accelerating decarbonisation across the Indian construction value chain. To discuss that, we've got an esteemed panel of guests today. We have with us Sandeep Sethi. He's the Managing Director, Work Dynamics West Asia at JLL. We also have with us Mr. Vipul Kumar, who's the Managing Director at Xynteo India. We also have with us Mr. Matthew, Senior Vice President and Business Head at Godrej Construction, Parth Jindal, the Managing Director at JSW Cement, Mr. Nitin Prasad, who's the Chairman at Shell Companies India, and finally Aun Abdullah, Sustainability Lead at Lodha. And joining us virtually for the panel today is Vikas Mehta, Executive Director, SED Funds. Thank you all for being with us today, and I'm going to begin with you, Sandeep, because it's real estate which has been in the spotlight. A lot of measures that have been announced by the government with respect to Atmanirbhar Bharat, income tax relief measures for the real estate developers, for home buyers, housing for all. How does real estate and infrastructure really fit into India's growth story, according to you?
It fits in really well, actually. Infrastructure, as we know, is very good for nation building. Infrastructure increases the valuation of real estate, and real estate positively impacts infrastructure. The government is doing a lot in terms of real estate from a support perspective. If you look at the impact real estate has on the economy today, it's about 8%, but the forecasts estimate that it will be about 13% in about 5 years' time. And real estate could be a $1 trillion sector in about 10 years' time. If you look at the biggest trend that's going to impact real estate and infrastructure is urbanization. Compared to 10 years back, another 400 million people will move to the urban parts of India. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on infrastructure and on real estate.
Which part brings me to the next question, growth and sustainability hand in hand in order for us to achieve these very ambitious targets. What kind of a role do you believe industrial sectors, particularly like cement, can play in aiding this growth?
I think steel and cement are two commodities that are required for infrastructure, that are required for real estate, and they account for 8% and 7% respectively of India's total and the world's total carbon dioxide emissions. I think what is going to make it extremely important and why platforms like Build Ahead are so important is that a manufacturer alone can only do so much. But if the end users, if the construction companies, the real estate companies, the government, everyone becomes aware of the kind of investments that are needed, the kind of premiums that need to be charged in order for these products to become economically viable, that's when really all of us can come together and really set a pathway for decarbonizing.
Nitin, I wanted to get in your thoughts as well. As the Chairman of Shell India, are you seeing a major push in this sector? As Parth said, we still have a long way to go, but there are a lot of efforts that are being made in this vein.
So many of our sectors and our industries have done a tremendous amount in terms of decarbonizing their business. We are some of the leading in terms of the lowest carbon emissions from our operations for steel and cement in those sectors. And largely, it's been a function of things like the PAT scheme. So that's worked, particularly well, where a government structure has come back in energy efficiency and incentivized, in some sense, for us to go and take that forward. And you started to see that reduction come through the operations that's there. As Parth also mentioned, there's a couple of other areas that are now taking off with the policy frameworks and support on renewable energy. You're starting to see much heavier adoption of renewable energy in many of these companies and sectors. Of course, that's a journey. Nobody gets to 100% renewable day one. So it's about integrating increasingly larger amounts of renewable power into the operations and activity that's there. I'll only qualify this in two different ways and say that, we see that the next couple of things that will get adopted and perhaps the more near term that's available is digital technologies. There's probably a lot more for us to do in terms of just pulling some more of the operational levers by becoming much more digitally enabled and getting the efficiencies that we see there. We see a lot more of a role to be played in some of the other base capabilities such as even integration of basic bioproducts into the thing.
Mr. Matthew, how do you believe that Build Ahead really is going to forge the way ahead for decarbonization? There are a lot of loopholes as well, or gaps rather, that they will definitely be addressed, correct?
So I think Build Ahead offers a good platform for all of us. We learn from each other in the process, and there are things which we can share, things which we have done. For example, on circularity, there's a lot of work which we were doing, and obviously it can't be just us. It has to work with everybody and in the ecosystem. So as we engage on platforms like this, we are happy to share some of these learnings with others, and in the process we can create a much better world as we go forward.
Mr. Mehta, I wanted to get in your thoughts on this because your fund, essentially philanthropic capital, it focuses on early stage, high impact ideas which paves the way for mobilizing resources at a scale for an equitable energy transition. In your experience, can you tell us what role finance has to play in India's decarbonization?
Thanks for having me on this panel. I really appreciate it. Finance has to play an absolutely massive role in the industrial decarbonization in India. Finance usually is the biggest bone of contention between the global north and the global south when you look at the UNFCCC conference every year. And I think that the global financial institutions already recognize that the transition to the net zero economy in various countries will involve more than simply the investments in wind, solar, or electric vehicles. It really has to go beyond that. So if we truly have to get the net zero across the whole economy, then the companies in steel, cement, construction, they will require financing to help them transition to green. And for many of these businesses, the transition will mean a fundamental change to their operations. So for these changes to actually happen, they do need capital, absolutely. And capital from all sources, debt capital, equity capital, grant capital, even 0% loans, which are typically called the program-related investments. And the role that the lenders, the investors, even the insurers will have to play will be absolutely crucial in making this capital available and to make sure that this transition actually happens.
Mr. Kumar, how do you believe that a lot more thrust on embodied carbon, how critical is the overall opportunity and this initiative being taken for sustainability and an urgency to ensure that India does meet the dual ambition of growth as well as sustainability?
There's multiple stakeholders involved as far as the embodied carbon is concerned, right from the consumer to steel manufacturers to cement producers, etc. Now the important part is how do you move ahead on decarbonization and be able to equitably distribute the risk, the cost of decarbonization. And so we think a sectorial approach is what is needed, an approach that really brings together the different stakeholders. It allows for the stakeholders to share the risks and the cost of decarbonization. And really that's the attempt that Build Ahead is trying to make, by bringing the coalition partners together, really representing supply, representing consumers, representing technology, finance. I think all of them have a very key role to play in moving the needle forward. And while we do so, I think really in terms of the areas that the coalition would work, one would be very strongly on the area of demand activation. So how do you enable the right definition of green cement? How do you enable the right standards? How do you create awareness for activating the demand? The second part would be, how do you help identify, test, and commercialize technologies by really bringing access to technologies and finance? And the third part would be on how do you build evidence to be able to have a meaningful conversations with other stakeholders and the government as far as policy change is concerned. So really these would be the important areas for us to focus under Build Ahead Coalition.
And I wanted to understand your perspective. How are you seeing urban growth and decarbonization really fitting together? What is it that you're seeing in terms of the future of housing, say 20 years down the line?
So as per a report by Niti Aayog, we are still a quasi-urban country. The rate at which we are urbanizing and this whole urban growth is going to be immense in the next 2 decades. And knowing that 1/6 of the population resides here, and this immense urbanization is going to happen, and all the people are moving from the rural side to the urban centers. We must be very cognizant of the fact that we should not create urban habitats which are with very high embodied carbon. And I think the mistake that can happen is that we lock in too much of carbon, which becomes a very big difficulty to decarbonize later. So it is essential to look at it as an urbanization issue, including the large residential component of it.
Parth, we're seeing a lot of large corporates making strides now towards decarbonization, but I wanted to understand from you, do you see this as an obligation to do this?
No, I think decarbonization also has a very large opportunity for industry, and it's not only a domestic opportunity, I think it's an international opportunity. Today the world is demanding green steel, the world is demanding green cement. And I think India is best positioned to actually deliver on some of these promises. Nitin touched on it earlier. If you look at what's happened in renewable energy with the advent of wind, solar, today India is manufacturing for the world. And it can do that for steel, it can do that for cement. Today India produces about 120 million tons of steel. This is likely to go to 300 million tons by 2030. That's 180 million tons of fresh capacity that's going to be added in India. This is unlike any other country other than China, and this kind of growth, this kind of scale is never going to be seen again for a very long time. So if it's the right time for India to embark on this journey, it's the right time for manufacturers to pick up this, this very important aspect, and we can manufacture here for the world. When I talk about the domestic opportunity, today going green is also going cost efficient. If you look at capturing the waste gases that are generated in the cement manufacturing process and converting that into energy, that's replacing coal, which India is importing today, right? Today we all know what's happening in Europe with the prices of thermal coal going so high. If we can capture our own gas and convert that into power and use that power to manufacture, that brings down our cost. If we can capture the alternate fuel, all the waste products that are produced in the pharmaceutical industry, that's produced by the farmers, and use that to incinerate in the kiln, that again brings down the cost of making it. So going green does not necessarily have to be an expensive affair. It can actually make you more cost competitive, and that's actually what is separating, I would say, the men from the boys in our industry. And going forward, it's going to be a very significant differentiator. So there's a very large opportunity for manufacturers. And similarly, on the scope 3 side, which is the movement of goods, today we all know what's happening to diesel prices. We all know what's happening with oil and crude oil increasing. If we move to electric, the technologies are developing, and there are companies piloting it already. If you move to electric, if you move to hydrogen, these are products that can be made in India with the resources we have in our country. So it will help our country reduce our current account deficit, and overall it could be a very, very big opportunity. So there's a lot that we all can be doing.
Sandeep, given that JLL is one of the largest construction companies in the country, you're working with Indian players as well as global. I just want to understand a little bit more about the sustainability ambitions, about how you're seeing a product market fit.
A lot of corporates have made pledges around net zero, and like I mentioned earlier, those who haven't will probably do so in the next 5 years or so. They realize that they have to address real estate in their decarbonization strategy because 40% of emissions come from there. And as a result of which, they made some policy changes. For example, a lot of large companies today, they insist on having green certified buildings as their office spaces. They're focusing a lot on operational carbon, so the carbon that's generated or emitted as a result of the electricity you use, the elevators, air conditioners, etc. There isn't enough weightage given to embodied carbon today, unfortunately, because there's a lack of awareness. And once we raise the awareness, there will be obviously an increase in demand, and that will incentivize the cement and steel manufacturers to make those investments to produce green cement and steel at scale. And that's really what we can hopefully drive with this coalition.
Mr. Matthew, in the Indian urban space, there are, multiple projects that are coming up for development, and at the same time, we see that a lot of them remain under construction or dilapidated or demolished. How are you ensuring that, infrastructure is not a disposable asset, and how do you see it's really supporting growth in India for the long term?
So one of the aspects that we need to look at when we're looking at embodied carbon is the aspect of circularity. And this is very important from a long-term life cycle assessment when we look at real estate assets or infrastructure. What happens very often is construction debris, especially concrete. If you don't address it effectively, it will land up in landfills. And the better way to solve that problem is as cities grow older, we will find more and more buildings will have to be demolished, and if it lands up in landfills, it is unsustainable. So one good way to look at addressing this is by bringing back concrete and recycling that and putting it back into concrete products, which again can go back into buildings. So when you look at the life cycle assessment, circularity in building construction is something which we can think through in the design stage, assess its impact from a life cycle assessment point of view, and you're then able to bring back those products, and instead of quarrying new hills every time, which is totally unsustainable, you can plow back a large part of 80-90% of the material can be plowed back into non-structural elements for a start.
Nitin, a balanced view from the industry, everyone coming together, that's something that Build Ahead is really providing. Would you concur?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a wonderful platform, Build Ahead, and let me just give you a slightly different flavor. Parth gave a good one on the government side, and we've heard other ones on the demand side. So here's the good news. We have all the technologies that we could possibly want to decarbonize the construction industry. Here's the challenge. We just need to scale them up. They're in that mid-range of technology development. There's ample pilot plants, the technology has been proven, but it needs commercialization and scaling. And in my mind, that can only happen if you work together in collaboration with some great partners such as the ones in Build Ahead.
And to take off from that, as a developer, he spoke of integration of policy framework, digital tech. Do you believe that these are some of the key levers in our journey towards sustainability?
Yes, they are. What we are trying to do through Lodha Net Zero Urban Accelerator, and as we are discussing with Build Ahead, is that we want to create a urbanization template that is efficient in operation and low in embodied carbon. It can be done at scale, and then it can be followed by everyone wherever this whole urbanization is happening. And we know that if it is done right at the onset itself, it will have huge impact in the decades to come.
And finally, Mr. Mehta, getting your views, as Parth said, go green but go fast. So how will Build Ahead help to accelerate that growth?
Well, I think that this question is for Vipul and the Xynteo team to answer, but I'll give you my response nevertheless. So I think that given the fact that you have in this coalition, you have the vertical of creation and adoption of standards, you have the vertical of demand activation, and you also have the vertical of mobilizing finance. It gives you a full spectrum of services to go with to get the industry's buy-in for decarbonization. And I think that's the most important issue at this point in time. Given that this coalition really covers it, it gives me a lot of confidence, and we are really proud to support this going forward.
And Mr. Kumar, if I could just come to you, because Build Ahead, it's a very exciting initiative. You really have your work already cut out for you. And I'm sure a lot of people want to learn a little bit more about this, seeing this approach actually making an impact. So I want to understand where really we go from here in terms of what's on the cards for Build Ahead.
It's really a great start to have partners like we have today on Build Ahead. And really, I think the focus for us would be in the beginning to focus on cement and concrete, but it'll be important for us to expand the other building materials too. But while we do that, really two focus areas for us immediately. One is how do we galvanize more partnerships from industry? How do we have the right conversation with other stakeholders, the rating agencies, the government bodies, and really be able to kind of mobilize a much stronger, I would say, force behind this work. And the second, as you said, I think collectively we have been able to define the roadmap for the next 3 years. So collectively as organization, as teams, the important thing for us would be to kind of build credible evidence to demonstrate that our theory of change really works, that demand activation and all the levers that we spoke about would start to move the needle towards decarbonization. And we very strongly feel that the next 2 to 3 years is going to be a tipping point in decarbonizing the built environment. And it's really a great opportunity to have Build Ahead really working in that direction.
And we wish you all the very best, because this is Build Ahead. It's essentially formed by Xynteo. It's a multi-stakeholder coalition to accelerate decarbonization. Thank you all for your insights as well as valuable outlook on the sector and how we can really do our best with respect to decarbonization. It's been a pleasure.